He didn't say it because it was true. He said it because a man named Ivo Kessler had left 3 photographs on his desk, and every one of them was of her, crossing a frozen street, laughing at something off-frame. Unaware she was being watched, Emmerich Thane had built everything he owned on a single rule. Nothing he loved could ever be used against him. So, at 11:40 that night, he looked the only person who had ever mattered dead in the eye, and told her he had never loved her. Maren believed him. She was gone before the frost melted off the windows, and that was the mistake that would unmake him. The office smelled of black coffee, gun oil and cold iron, and Emmerich Thane had arranged his entire life so that it would never smell of anything else. He stood at the tall window on the top floor of the Meridian Bank, watching his city wake up under a skin of ice. 9 floors down, the Coldwater rail yards stretched toward the river in long silver ribbons. Freight cars nosed together like sleeping animals, their roofs dusted white. Every one of those cars belonged to him. Half of them carried grain and steel and things a customs officer would sign for without reading. The other half carried the reason: he owned a bank. Emmerich watched a switch engine drag a line of them into the fog and felt nothing, which was exactly how he preferred to feel about the things that made him rich. Behind him, a radiator ticked. A pen moved across paper. That second sound was the only one in the room he actually listened for. "You're standing at the window again," Maren said, not looking up. "You do that when you've already decided something and haven't told me yet." "I'm admiring my holdings. You're brooding, at a train yard, in your socks." She turned a page. "Your holdings don't need admiring. They need you to sign the Ostgate transfer before 10, because the notary leaves for his daughter's christening at 10:05. And he is the only notary in this city who doesn't ask questions. And I would like you to sign it while he still likes us." Emmerich turned from the glass. She was sitting at the small desk that had lived in the corner of his office for 4 years, wrapped in a gray wool coat she refused to take off because he kept the room cold, and she was always the one who felt it. She was not beautiful in any way a magazine would recognize. She was medium in every dimension a person could be measured in: medium height, medium brown hair, pinned back with something that was not quite a pencil, a face you would forget on a train and then find yourself trying to remember for the rest of the day. She was the least intimidating person in a building full of men who broke thumbs for a living. She was also the only one of them he could not afford to lose, and he had spent 4 years pretending that wasn't true. "Ledger," he said, and held out his hand. She didn't hand him a ledger. There was no ledger. That was the point of her. Maren didn't write down the things that could hang him: the favors owed, the men on payroll inside the police district, the exact figure Judge Aldous still owed from a bad night at a table in Ostgate. She kept all of it behind that unremarkable face, filed in an unremarkable head, and she could produce any piece of it in under 3 seconds without ever leaving a mark on paper. "Aldous," she said, "you want to lean on him for the dock permits. I want to know if I can." "You can. He owes you $41,000 and an alibi from the spring. But don't do it this month." She finally looked up. Her eyes were a plain, flat brown, and they missed absolutely nothing. His wife's brother just joined the state prosecutor's office. Squeeze him now and he'll fold. But he'll remember. Wait until summer. Let him think you forgot. Men are always more grateful for the debts. You let them believe you've forgotten. Emmerich looked at her for a moment longer than a man looks at his secretary. This was the thing no one else understood about Maren. Not Teo, not the accountants, not the cousins who called her the girl when they thought he couldn't hear. They saw a woman who fetched his coffee and kept his calendar. They did not see that she carried the actual machine of his empire inside her skull, that she had a memory like a closing vault, and that on the 3 occasions in 4 years when someone had walked into this office intending to kill him, she had been the one who noticed the wrong shoes, the extra weight in a coat, the name that didn't match the face, a heartbeat before it would have been too late. The first time 4 years ago he had put it down to luck. The second time he had told himself she was observant. By the third, A man with a florist's apron and a delivery no one had ordered, whom she had turned away at the door with a smile, while her foot found the alarm under her desk. Hey, Emmerich had understood that he had accidentally hired the most dangerous person in the building, and that she had chosen to point all of that danger at keeping him alive. He had never asked why. Asking why would have meant looking directly at the thing. And Emmerich did not look directly at things he could lose. He had built a wall around himself, out of never needing anyone. She had walked through it, carrying his coffee, and he had let her, and he had told himself every single day that letting her was not the same as needing her. Sign the Ostgate paper, she said, sliding it across the desk. The notary. 10 o'clock. Emmerich. He signed it. She always won these. She won them so gently, he never noticed losing. Teo came in without knocking. Teo never knocked, which a privilege was earned by 15 years and one bullet taken in a stairwell that had been meant for Emmerich. He was broad and quiet and moved like a closing door. He set a slim envelope on the desk, and Emmerich knew, from the way he set it down, carefully, the way you set down something you'd rather not be holding, that the morning was over. This was at the yard gate, Teo said. No stamp. Kid on a bicycle, dropped it, and rode off before the cameras got him. Whose kid? Didn't know him. That's the part I don't like, boss. I know all the kids. Emmerich opened the envelope with a letter knife Marin had given him 3 Christmases ago, back when he still pretended not to keep the things she gave him. 3 photographs slid out onto the desk. He looked at them for a long time. They were of Marin, one of her at the market on Varon Street, choosing apples, one of her stepping off the number 4 tram in the dark, one of her here, at this building at the gate, her face turned up toward the 9th floor window, as if she knew someone was watching and was checking whether that someone was him. On the back of the 3rd, in careful block letters, someone had written a single line. A man is only as safe as the thing he can't afford to lose. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Only one man in the city wrote his threats like proverbs, and Emmerich had watched him do it once, years ago, in a warehouse that had burned down the same week, with Emmerich's father still inside it. Ivo Kessler was supposed to be finished. Ivo Kessler was supposed to be a story old men told to frighten each other over cards. The patient man, the one who waited so long between moves that his enemies forgot they were still in a game with him and then discovered they had never left it. Ivo Kessler had just told Emmerich exactly where his heart was and how easy it would be to stop. Boss, Teo said. What is it? Emmerich turned the photographs face down, one by one, with a hand that did not shake because he would not permit it to. Across the room, Marin had gone still. Not frightened. She didn't do frightened. But alert, the way she went before she said wrong shoes, reading his face the way she read everything, and he realized with a cold, dropping certainty that she was about to figure it out. She figured out everything. It was what made her priceless. It was, as of this morning, what was going to get her killed. Nothing, Emmerich said. Old business. She didn't believe him. He watched her not believe him, watched her file his flat voice and his face-down photographs and his sudden interest in the window, watched her set the whole contradiction aside to be examined later, as she set aside everything she wasn't yet meant to know. And somewhere behind his ribs, in the room he kept locked, a man he had spent his whole life refusing to be began, very quietly, to make a plan he already hated. He waited until the building was empty. He waited on purpose, which he understood even as he did. It was a coward's kind of mercy. No witnesses meant no one would ever know he'd had to work up to it. The cousins had gone home. The accountants had gone home. Teo was downstairs in the car with the heater running, because Emmerich had told him they were driving out to the yards at midnight, and Teo, who did not ask questions that started with why, had simply nodded and gone to warm the engine. Only Marin stayed, because Marin always stayed. First light on in the morning, last light off at night. 4 years, and he had never once beaten her into the office or watched her leave before him. He had come to think of it the way you think of the sun, not as a person who chose to be there, but as a condition of the room. She was at her desk in the cold, in the gray coat, winding the small brass clock that sat on the windowsill. It ran slow. She wound it every night, the same way. 3 half-turns, no more, because she said a clock you overwound was a clock that lied to you about time, and Marin could not abide a thing that lied about time. He was about to make her the biggest liar in the building. Go home, Marin. In a minute. The clock. Leave the clock. Something in his voice made her set it down. She turned in her chair. Under the single desk lamp her plain face was tired, and open in a way it never was during business hours. And he hated that he was about to be the last thing it opened for. What did the photographs say? She asked quietly. Not what were they. She already knew what they were. She'd read it off his hands at 10 this morning and spent the whole day waiting for him to lie about it again. This was the moment. He had turned it over all day, looking for another door, and there wasn't one. If Kessler believed she mattered to him, she was already a target, a lever, a soft place, a message that could be sent by hurting her. The only way to make her safe was to make her worthless. To make Kessler watch him throw her away with his own hands, publicly, permanently, and so completely that no one in the city would ever again believe Emmerich Vane could be reached through the woman who kept his books. He could protect her, or he could keep her. He had run the numbers all afternoon, the way she taught him to, coldly, to the last decimal, and the numbers only balanced one way. So he built his face into the face his enemies knew, the flat, bored, faraway face of a man discussing freight, and he lied to her the way he had never lied to anyone, with total commitment, holding her eyes so she'd have no crack to see through. I'm restructuring, he said. The operation's too exposed. I'm cutting the positions that create risk. A pause. Precisely waited. Yours is one of them. She blinked. You're firing me. I'm ending an arrangement that stopped being useful. Emmerich. A small, disbelieving laugh. And it cut him worse than a blade would have. I know where everybody in this city is buried. Literally. I am the least dispensable person you employ, and you know it better than anyone, so whatever this actually is, you've confused proximity with importance, he said. It's a common mistake in people who spend too long near power. You fetch things, you remember things. That's clerical. I can hire clerical. He let his gaze go over her, once, dismissive, and it was the hardest physical act of his life. I think you've also confused a working relationship for something warmer. That's my fault. I let it go on too long because it was convenient. But let me be clear, so there's no misunderstanding when you're gone. He made himself say it evenly, like a fact off a ledger, like the truest thing he knew was the opposite of what came out of his mouth. I never loved you, Marin. I never came close. You were staff. The room went very quiet. The slow, brass clock ticked, lying about. The time he had expected her to argue. She argued everything. It was the whole shape of her. He had braced for it, had planned his answers, and had told himself he could hold the wall as long as she pushed against it. She didn't push. That was the thing that nearly broke him. She just looked at him for a long moment with those plain brown eyes that missed nothing, and he watched something behind them, close, quietly, without drama, the way she wound the clock, the way she did everything. Not the look of a woman who'd been lied to. The look of a woman who had just decided to believe him, because believing him was less humiliating than the alternative, and Marin would always, always choose her own dignity over the comfort of a truth she couldn't prove. All right, she said. She stood. She took her scarf off the hook. She moved around the small desk one last time, and out of 4 years of habit, that not even this could break, she squared the pen against the edge of the blotter, capped the inkwell, and turned the desk lamp so it wouldn't glare on the chair for whoever sat there next. Tidying his life. Even as she left it, she did not cry, and she did not slam anything, and she did not tell him what she thought of him, and every one of those silences was worse than the last. At the door, she stopped. She didn't turn all the way around. "The eldest debt is 41,000, she said to the doorframe. "Wait until summer. The notary leaves at 10:05, so don't schedule anything at 10. Petrus in the registry takes an envelope on the second Osgate signature. He takes it at the coffee stand on Varin, not at his office, so don't send anyone to his office." A breath. "And the man who took those photographs of me," a small pause, and he realized she'd known that too, all of it. "From the start, he wasn't a stranger to you. You went gray when you saw the handwriting. Whatever he wants, you're about to give it to him for free, and you're too proud to see that you just did." She pulled the scarf tight. "Goodbye, Emmerich." Then she was gone, and the door clicked shut with the same soft finality as everything else she did. And Emmerich Vane stood alone in the cold office he had built to smell of nothing, listening to a slow clock tell him lies about how much time he had left. He told himself he had won. He told himself she was safe now. He would remember thinking that for the rest of his life, because 6 hours later Theo would call him at dawn with his voice wrong. And Emmerich would learn that Ivo Kessler had never intended to take the thing Emmerich loved. He'd intended to wait for Emmerich to throw it out into the cold. Alone, unguarded, unclaimed, and then simply pick it up. The phone rang at 5:52 in the morning, and Emmerich answered it on the first ring because he had not slept. He was still in the chair by the window, still in yesterday's shirt, watching the rail yards turn from black to the color of dirty tin as the light came up over the river. He had told himself, somewhere around 3, that the hollow feeling in his chest was relief. He had told himself that a man who felt this bad about doing the right thing was at least a man who'd done the right thing. He had a whole architecture of these small lies built up by dawn, and Theo's voice took it down in 4 words. "Boss, she's not home." Emmerich was on his feet before he understood he'd moved. "Say that again, Marin." "I went by like you said to make sure she got in all right." A pause, and in the pause Emmerich could hear Theo breathing wrong, fast and shallow, the way he'd breathed in the stairwell 15 years ago with a bullet in him. "Doors open, boss. Not forced, open. Her keys are in the bowl, her coat's on the hook, the gray one, she'd never leave it, it's freezing. There's a chair knocked over in the kitchen, and one shoe in the hall, and the other one still by the bed." Another breath, and there's a photograph on the table. "Same as yesterday, she's in it. She's asleep in it, boss. Or she's meant to look asleep, and I can't tell which. And on the back, it says, read it. It says, 'Thank you for setting the table.'" The city went very quiet around Emmerich, the way a room goes quiet when a gun comes out. Thank you for setting the table. He'd done it himself. He'd cleared her off the board with his own hands, made her unguarded, made her unclaimed, walked her out into the cold and shut the door on her, and Kessler had simply been waiting on the other side of that door the way a patient man waits under a tree for the fruit to fall. He hadn't had to lift her out of a guarded life. Emmerich had handed her over the threshold, alone, at midnight, with no one told to watch the number 4 tram. Every calculation Emmerich had run last night, the cold, careful arithmetic of protection, had been the arithmetic of a man solving the wrong problem with total confidence and getting a beautiful, exact, wrong answer. He looked down at his own hands. They were steady. He hated that they were steady. A better man's hands would have shaken. "Boss," Theo said, "what do you want me to do?" "Touch nothing. Stand in the hall." Emmerich was already pulling his coat on over yesterday's shirt, already down the first flight, the words coming out flat and fast and precise, because precision was the only thing left in the building that hadn't betrayed him. "I want the tram cameras from Varin, and 4th from 11:40 last night to 2. I want to know which of Kessler's people are back in the city, and which beds they slept in. I want Aldous awake, and I want him afraid, and I want a man on his brother-in-law, the prosecutor, because if this becomes a body I want to know before the state does. And I want you to understand something, Theo, because I'm only going to say it once. Yeah, Boss, I did this. Not Kessler. Me. So don't waste a single second telling me it wasn't my fault, because I will not have the patience for the kindness. He hit the ground floor, shouldered through the glass door into a cold that took the breath out of him, and stood for 1 second in it, the exact cold he had thrown her into 6 hours ago, thinking it was a gift. Get the car warm. We start at her apartment. He hung up. For 4 years he had begun every morning the same way, coffee already hot on the corner of his desk, the day's landmines already mapped, a plain brown gaze already lifting to tell him what he'd missed in his sleep. She would say the Halloran shipment is a day late and that's not weather, that's someone testing you. Or, your cousin Rennie spent Tuesday night in Osgate and lied about where. And she would be right, and he would act on it and take the credit inside his own head and never once say thank you, because thanking her would have meant admitting he'd have missed it. He had thought of her, the way you think of the sun, as a condition of the room. He stood alone on the frozen street, with no coffee and no map, and no one to tell him what he'd missed, and for the first time in his adult life, Emeric Vane did not know what the wrong shoes looked like. He only knew that somewhere in his city, a man was counting on that, and had been counting on it. Patiently, for 20 years, by noon he understood the true size of what he had lost, and it had nothing to do with love. He'd gone to her apartment first. It told him almost nothing, which told him everything. The overturned chair, the single shoe, the photograph, all of it arranged with the same care Kessler put into his handwriting. A man who wanted her dead would have left her there. A man who left a thank you note wanted Emeric to know she was alive, and wanted him to spend every hour imagining the ways that could change. It was a hook, with a person on it. Emeric had used the same kind himself, more than once, on men who thought their families made them stronger, recognizing his own methods turned in him like a swallowed blade. The apartment gave him one more thing before he left it, and it was worse than the note. It was empty. Not ransacked, empty, lived in, empty. There was a single plate in the rack, a single cup, a kettle, a narrow bed, made with hospital corners. There were no photographs on the walls, no clutter, nothing soft, and nothing that said a person had built a life here rather than merely waited in it. She earned enough to live twice this well. She had chosen to live like someone who might have to leave in the night with one bag, and had lived that way for 4 years, 3 floors above a shuttered laundry, while she ran the finances of one of the largest criminal operations on the river. He had never once wondered where she slept, but it was back at the Meridian, in the long grinding hours after, that the ground truly went out from under him. Because the empire didn't run, he'd never once watched it not run. At 10, the Ostgate transfer bounced. The notary had a question about a second signature, and there was no one who knew that the second signature was a formality they paid a man in the registry to overlook, and there was no one who remembered that the man's name was Petrus, or that he took the envelope at a coffee stand and not at his office. Because the only place that had ever been written down was behind a plain, forgettable face that was no longer in the building. She had told him, at the door, at 11:40. He had been too busy congratulating himself on saving her to write it down. At 11, 2 of his own captains nearly came to blows in the outer office, over territory along the river, each certain the other had crossed a line, and Emeric realized, standing between them, that he did not actually know where the line was. Marin had known. Marin had brokered it, quietly, 18 months ago, in a conversation he'd half listened to while signing something else. She had held a dozen fragile pieces like that in her head, tending them, adjusting them, and none of them had ever risen to his attention, precisely because she had kept them from breaking. At 11:30, a courier arrived for a payment that Emeric had no record of owing, to a man he'd never heard of. And when he said as much, the courier went pale and said the arrangement had been made through the office, and left, and Emeric understood that he had just, in one sentence, defaulted on a debt he didn't know he had to a man he'd now insulted, and that he had no way of even finding out how bad that was, because the only index of who Emmerich Vane owed, and why, and how much it would cost to be late, had walked out the door with a scarf and a slow clock's worth of warning. He sat behind his desk at noon in a building that was quietly coming apart at every joint she had been holding together, and he finally understood the thing his cousins had never seen, and he himself had refused to look at straight. She hadn't fetched his coffee. She had been the load-bearing wall. Every man in the operation thought he answered to Emmerich, and every one of them had actually been standing, without knowing it, on a floor she had built and swept and kept level. He'd thought he was the empire, and she was the furniture. He'd had it exactly backwards, and it had taken her absence to draw the outline of how much space she'd actually filled, the way you only see the true shape of a thing by the hole it leaves. T.O. came in at 12:40 with the tram footage and a face like a fist. We got her on Varon, 11:51, walking home, alone. Then, he set a grainy still on the desk. This car pulls level with her for half a block. Plates are mud. But look at the door, boss. Emmerich looked. On the rear door of the car, half scraped off but not gone, was a shipping stencil. A stylized letter K inside a cog. He knew it. Everyone his age in this city knew it. It was the mark that had been on the crates in the warehouse the night his father burned, 20 years ago, Kessler's mark. The one he'd stamped on everything he owned back when he owned half the river, before he'd gone quiet and let the whole city decide he was finished. The story every capo told was that the fire had finished Kessler too, that he'd overreached against the veins, lost his warehouses and his standing in one bad winter, and crawled off somewhere to die of pride. Emmerich had believed that story for 20 years, because it was a comfortable story, and because the man who told it to him best was his own uncle, and, you believe your family, he wasn't finished. He'd just spent 20 years being patient, the one virtue Emmerich had never learned, and he'd come back, not for the docks, or the yards, or the bank. He'd come back for the one debt, older than all of them. Boss, Teo said quietly. There's more. The kid on the bicycle from yesterday, the one who dropped the photographs. We found him, he talked. Teo hesitated, and Teo did not hesitate. He said the man who paid him had a message, in case you traced it back. He said to tell you. Teo's jaw worked. Ask her what her real name is. The clock on the windowsill, the slow one, ticked once into the silence. Emmerich had known Marin for 4 years. He knew how she took her tea and which hand she favored, and the exact weight of her silence when she disapproved of him. He knew she wound a clock 3 turns and never 4, and that she hated a thing that lied about time, and that she squared his pen against the blotter on her way out of his life. He had trusted her with every secret that could hang him. He did not, he realized, know her name. The strongbox was behind the radiator, which was the last place Emmerich would ever have looked, which was exactly why she'd put it there. He found it because he finally did the thing he should have done at 5:52 that morning, and thought like her, instead of like himself. He'd been tearing through the obvious places, her desk, the files, the safe she officially kept, and finding only the immaculate, impersonal order of a woman who left no trace. Then he'd stopped in the middle of the ransacked office, breathing hard, and asked himself the question she would have asked: where does a person hide something from a man who owns every obvious place? Somewhere he'd never be cold enough to check, somewhere warm. He'd knelt by the radiator that ran under the windowsill, the one she wound the slow clock above every night, and found the panel loose, and behind it, a flat steel box no bigger than a book. It wasn't locked. That frightened him more than a lock would have. A lock is a lie about safety, she used to say. It only tells you which thing is worth the 2 minutes it takes to break. She'd left it for him to find. Someday, if she was ever gone. She'd planned, even for this. She'd planned, he understood, for a version of this exact morning, for Emmerich Vane, on his knees on a cold floor, finally cold enough to think of somewhere warm. Inside were 3 things. The first was a passport, The photograph was hers, the plain, forgettable, unforgettable face, but the name beneath it was not Marin. The name beneath it was Anik Kessler. Emmerich sat down on the cold floor because his legs made the decision for him. The second thing was a photograph, old, and the colors gone amber. A man, he recognized instantly, younger, standing in front of a warehouse, with a stencil of a K in a cod behind him. Ivo Kessler, 30 years and 40 pounds ago. His hand rested on the shoulder of a girl of maybe 7, solemn, plain, watching the camera with a flat brown gaze that missed nothing even then. On the back, in a child's careful block letters, the same careful block letters that had written "A man is only as safe as the thing he can't afford to lose." Someone had practiced writing a name over and over, the way children do, learning the shape of the thing they are. Anik, Anik, Anik. She was Kessler's daughter. The warehouse behind them in the photograph was the warehouse. Emmerich had stood in its burned-out shell at 19, the winter after the fire, at his uncle's insistence, so he would remember what the Kesslers had cost the Vanes. He had been made to memorize the enemy's mark on the ruined crates. No one had thought to make him memorize the enemy's child. She had been standing right there, 7 years old, learning to write her name in front of the building that would define both their lives. And 20 years later, she had walked into his office, carrying his coffee, and he had looked at her every single day and seen staff. The third thing was a letter, in her adult hand, addressed to no one, or to him, or to the version of him that would eventually be desperate enough to look behind a radiator. He read it on the floor in the gray noon light, with the slow clock ticking above his head. She had not come to him by accident. 4 years ago, Ivo Kessler had sent his own daughter into the vein operation the way you send in a blade you've spent years sharpening, to get close, to learn where everybody was buried, to hollow the whole thing out from the inside and hand it to her father when the time came for the old man to finish what a warehouse fire had started. That was the mission. She had trained for it her whole life. She had taken it. She had been for a while, exactly the weapon he'd raised her to be. She named the 3 men she'd quietly compromised in her first year, the accounts she'd copied, the night she had come within a signature of handing Emmerich's whole payroll structure to a man in Osgate who worked for her father. And then, the letter said, in her flat, unsentimental hand, that broke him worse than sentiment ever could have, "I made a mistake. I started keeping your empire safe, instead of taking it apart. I told myself I was being thorough." Thoroughness meant learning every weak point, and once I'd learned them, I couldn't stop myself mending them, and a person who mends a thing every day for 4 years has stopped being its enemy and started being its wall. Whatever she tells herself at night. I was lying to myself about time, and I of all people should know better than to overwind a clock. She had buried the mission. She had chosen him, not with declarations. She'd never once said a soft word to him in 4 years, but in the only language she trusted. She had quietly, methodically, made herself the wall that kept him standing, and she had spent 4 years betraying her own father, one small act of loyalty at a time. Turning away the florist, squaring the pen, winding the clock. 1,000 tiny defections, each one deniable, each one a stone laid in a wall around a man who thought he'd built himself. Kessler knew. That was the thing that turned Emmerich's blood to river ice. As he sat there, Kessler had found out his daughter had gone soft on the mark, and Ivo Kessler was not a man who forgave a debt, not from a stranger and not from his own blood. The photographs, the thank you note, ask her what her real name is. None of it was aimed at hurting Emmerich by taking her. It was aimed at making Emmerich do the executioner's first job for him. Kessler had shown Emmerich those pictures, knowing exactly how a man like Vane would react, that a man who had built his life on nothing I love can be used against me would, the instant he believed she was a weakness, cut her loose to protect her. He had counted on Emmerich's one virtue turning into the knife, because throwing her out didn't just break her heart. It stripped her of the one thing that had ever protected her, being the untouchable, indispensable right hand of Emmerich Vane, a woman no one dared move against because moving against her meant war with the whole Vane operation. The moment Emmerich called her staff and opened the door, she stopped being a fortress and became a woman walking home alone past a car with muddy plates. The old man hadn't needed to turn Emmerich against his daughter. He'd only needed Emmerich to love her badly enough, and stupidly enough, and secretly enough to do it himself and call it mercy. Emmerich read the last line 4 times. If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and it's not your fault, whatever they told you, to make you believe it was. You were always going to choose the empire. You were built to the same way. I was built to take it from you. And neither of us ever got a vote in what we were built to be. I chose you anyway. That was my mistake, and I'd make it again. Wind the clock. He set the letter down very carefully on the cold floor, because his hands had finally mercifully begun to shake. She had not been his assistant. She had been a weapon aimed at his heart that had chosen, against every instinct her father had forged into her, to guard it instead. She had known exactly what he would do if he ever felt the fear he felt yesterday, because she knew him better than he knew himself, and she had left the box unlocked anyway, and left him a way to understand it, because even walking out the door, believing he'd never loved her, she had gone on protecting him. From himself this time. It was the last thing she'd filed before she left. And he had looked that choice in the eye at 11:40 last night and called it staff. Downstairs a car door slammed, then another. Then, the particular silence of several men getting out of a vehicle and not talking. Teo's voice came up the stairwell, tight and low. "Boss, we've got company at the gate. It's Kessler's people. They're not here to fight." A pause. "They're here to deliver something." Emmerich rose from the floor. He put the passport in one pocket and the child's photograph in the other over his heart, where he should have kept her all along. "Let them come up," he said. They sent one man up, and he came empty-handed, which was its own kind of message. He was old, nearly as old as Kessler himself, with a face like a folded map and a coat too thin for the season, and he walked into the office where Merrick had built his whole life without so much as glancing at the men Teo had posted on either side of the door. He set a small object on the desk, dead center, on the exact spot where 3 photographs had sat 2 days ago. Then he stepped back and folded his hands and waited, patient as his master. It was a brass clock, small, slow, the enamel worn thin around the winding key, not the one from his own windowsill. That one still sat 10 feet away, ticking where she'd left it 2 nights ago. This was its twin. This was hers, from her apartment. For a moment, Emmerich couldn't speak, because the sight of it told him what it meant before the old man could. They had been inside her rooms, among her few plain things, and out of everything there, they had chosen this to carry back to him, the one object she cared about, the one that, like the one on his windowsill, also kept poor time. "Kessler thought you'd want it back," the old man said. His voice was dry as paper. "He said to tell you it keeps poor time. He said you'd understand what he meant." Emmerich did not touch it. "Where is she?" "Alive. For now." "That much, I'm to confirm, so you don't do anything final out of grief." The old man's eyes moved, once, over the ransacked office, the pulled files, the loose radiator panel, and something almost like pity crossed the folded map of his face. "You found the box, then, behind the radiator. She always did think you'd never be cold enough to look somewhere warm." He said it the way a man says, a thing he'd warned someone about long ago. "I taught her half of what she knows, Mr. Vane. The old man taught her the other half. I taught her the soft half, how to be forgotten, how to be furniture, how to make a dangerous man comfortable enough to stop counting the exits when she's in the room. Kessler taught her the hard half. Between the two of us, we made her the finest instrument this city ever produced. And then she went and used herself on the wrong lock, and now we've all got to live with the noise. Tell me what he wants." "He wants to give you a choice, which is more than he gave your father." The old man reached into his thin coat, slowly, so no one in the room would misread the motion, and drew out a single folded paper and laid it beside the clock. The yards, the bank, the registry man, the police district, the judge, the Halloran contract, all of it, signed over clean, notarized by Friday noon. In exchange, the girl walks out of a warehouse on the East Bank on her own 2 feet, and the Kessler and Vane accounts are settled forever and no one else has to burn. He paused. That's the offer. Now, I'll tell you the truth of it, because I'm old and I've watched this family eat itself for 40 years and I'm tired. He doesn't want your empire, Mr. Vane. He can barely hold what he has. His own men are half of them borrowed, and the other half afraid. He wants to watch you sign it away for her, wants you to prove, on paper, in front of witnesses, that his daughter was worth more to you than everything you own. And then, when you've proven it, the folded face went very still. He's going to kill her in front of you anyway, because a daughter who betrays her father for a mark doesn't get to be worth something. She has to be worth nothing, or the whole shape of his life comes apart in his hands. You, following me? The room had gone, the particular quiet of men who are afraid to breathe. Why, Emmerich said, are you telling me this? Because I held that girl when she was a day old, and her mother made me promise, and I've broken every other promise I ever made, but I find at the end I can't quite break that one. The old man buttoned his thin coat. Her mother was the only thing Ivo ever loved that he didn't ruin, and only because she died before he got the chance. He's been ruining her memory through the daughter ever since. Every year, a little more, making the girl into the weapon he wished he'd been. Anki's spent her whole life being the blade her father sharpened against his own grief. Yesterday's the first time in 30 years anybody gave her a way out of that. And you did it by accident, by throwing her in the gutter, so don't go feeling proud. He almost smiled. He didn't. The warehouse is the one behind the cannery on Dolan Wharf. There'll be 6 men, maybe 8, and the old man in the office at the back where he can watch through the glass. He wants you to come Friday, alone, with the papers. He is not expecting you before Friday. And he is not expecting you to bring anything but a pen. He walked to the door. There he stopped, the way she had stopped, and did not turn all the way around. She used to say you were the only man she'd ever met who could read a room in a second and a person never. She said it like a complaint, and I always thought it was something else. I'd take it to heart if I were you. You've got until Friday to learn to read the person. It's Wednesday now. And then, softer, to the doorframe, wind the clock 3 turns, no more. She'd want it kept right, wherever this ends. He left. Downstairs, car doors closed, one after another, and the vehicles pulled away into the cold, and the silence they left behind was the loudest thing Emmerich had heard in his life. He looked at the clock. He looked at the folded paper, the deed, to everything he was waiting for his signature. He thought about the arithmetic he'd run 2 nights ago, the cold, clean numbers that had balanced only one way. And he understood at last that he had been solving for the wrong thing his entire life. He had spent 40 years learning to read rooms so no one could ever surprise him, and he had never once learned to read the one person who mattered, because reading her would have meant admitting she mattered, and admitting she mattered would have meant he could lose her. He had lost her, anyway. The wall had bought him nothing, it never did. He picked up the clock, hers, the one they'd taken from her rooms, and set it beside the other on the windowsill. So the 2 of them ticked together, slightly out of time. He wound them both. 3 turns, no more. Teo, he said. It's Wednesday. Yeah, boss. He gave us until Friday because he thinks I'm a man who'll spend 2 days working up the nerve to sign. Emmerich turned from the window. Something had come into his face that Teo had only seen twice before, both times just before a great deal of the city changed hands. Let's disappoint him. He did not spend Wednesday night grieving. He spent it doing the thing she would have done, which was the only prayer he had left to offer her. He cleared the long table in the conference room and put the whole war on it in pieces, laying it out so he could see it, instead of merely hear it, exactly as she used to. The tram map, the wharf, harbor tide tables. Because the cannery sat over water, and water was a door most men forgot to lock. Every name Tio could shake loose about who was back in the city. Under Kessler's mark, 9 men, most of them old, 2 of them borrowed from an Ostgate crew that owed the old man a favor and wouldn't die for him. And at the center, the child's photograph, from the strongbox, the 7-year-old with the flat brown gaze, propped against a water glass so he'd remember, every time he looked up, exactly what the arithmetic was for this time. Walk me through it like she would, he told Teo at 2 in the morning, both of them hollow-eyed over cold coffee. Not what I want to do, what's true. What's true? Teo said slowly, is he holds the one card that beats everything you've got, and he knows it, and he's counting on you, knowing it too. Long as he's got her, you can't move on the warehouse, because the first shot fired is the one that ends her. That's the whole trap. It only works because she's inside it. Frontal, we lose her in the first 3 seconds. Quiet, we still trip a guard eventually, and the second a guard yells. The old man puts one in her out of spite and calls it even. He rubbed his face. I don't see the door, boss. There isn't one. Then we take the card off the table before we play the hand. How? We don't even know which room they've got her in. The office? At the back, behind the glass, where he can watch. Emmerich turned the old man's warning over in his mind like a coin. You've got until Friday to learn to read the person. Kessler had raised Marin to be an instrument, and an instrument, Emmerich had learned across 4 years of standing near her, does the same thing under pressure every single time. It falls back on training. It falls back on habit. And her habit, the deepest one, the one under all the others, was to protect the thing she'd decided to protect, quietly, with small, exact, deniable acts, and to assume the one man who mattered was smart enough to eventually notice. He thought of the slow clock, of 3 turns, no more, of a woman who left a strongbox unlocked because a lock was a lie, who squared his pen on her way out of his life, who could not abide a thing that lied about time. He thought of what she would be doing right now, in the dark, in a warehouse full of her father's tired old men, who had every one of them, made the same mistake Emmerich had made for 4 years. They had looked at the plain, forgettable woman in the corner and stopped counting her. If she's alive in that warehouse, she's already working, Emmerich said. She won't sit and wait to be rescued. She's never waited for anything in her life. She'll be reading her father's men, the way she read every man who ever walked into this office, filing their habits, their blind spots, the wrong shoes, and she'll be leaving me something. Some small, exact, deniable thing, because that's the only language she trusts, and because she'll assume I'm finally cold enough to come looking somewhere warm. He set his knuckles on the table. So the plan can't be a plan, not a clean one. A clean plan has no room in it for a variable I can't see. The plan has to have a hole in it exactly her size, and we have to trust, going in, blind, no confirmation, that she'll have filled it. That's not a plan, boss. It's the same thing she offered me for 4 years, and I called it clerical. Emmerich looked down at the child in the photograph, at the block letters practicing a name on the back, Annika, Annika, Anik, a name her father had given her, and then decided she wasn't allowed to keep. Here's the shape of it. We come from the water, on the tide, an hour before midnight. Thursday, not Friday. We give up every advantage he thinks he's bought. The extra day, the pen, my nerve, the front gate. We spend all of it on the one advantage he doesn't know I have, which is that I finally understand what she is, and that her father who made her has forgotten it, because to him she's still the 7-year-old learning to write her name in front of his warehouse. He thinks she's tied up in the dark, waiting to be a lesson. Emmerich picked up the photograph and put it back in his breast pocket, over his heart. He put a weapon in a dark room and turned his back on it. We're going to go collect what it's been building. Teo was quiet a moment. And if she's not building anything, if she's just hurt, or drugged or he didn't finish. Then I'll have failed her twice, Emmerich said, and I'll only deserve to have done it once. He straightened. Get the boats. Get the men who don't ask questions. The 6 from the harbor. Not the cousins. I don't want a single man out there who's ever sat at a table with Kessler's people, suppressed weapons. No explosives, nothing that brings the roof down. Because I don't know which corner of the dark she's in, and I am not going to be the one who buries her. We move at 11. Go. Teo went to make the calls. At the door, he paused. Everyone paused at that door lately, Emmerich had noticed. As if the room itself had learned the trick from her and said, without turning, "For what it's worth, boss. 4 years I watched you not see her." I didn't see her either. Nobody did. That was the whole point of her. Then he was gone. Emmerich was left alone with the 2 slow clocks, and the cold coffee, and the war laid out in pieces on the table. He wound the clocks, 3 turns each, no more. Then he sat in the dark, and did the thing he had never once done in his cold, careful, load-bearing life. He hoped. The cannery on Dolan Wharf smelled of dead fish and diesel, and the green rot of old rope, and the cold came off the black water in sheets that found every gap in a man's coat. They came in from the waterside, 4 boats, no lights, and the outboards cut 100 yards out, so the last of the approach was done on oars, through a skin of ice that hissed against the hulls. Thursday, an hour before midnight, a full day before Kessler expected a soul. Emmerich crouched in the lead boat with a child's photograph pressed to his chest through his coat, and watched the dark bulk of the warehouse rise against the orange stain of the city sky. And he counted windows, and he found the one at the back that glowed faint yellow behind a sheet of grimed glass. The office, Kessler watching. 2 on the roof. Teo breathed beside him, glasses to his eyes. 1 on the loading dock, smoking, which means he's cold and bored and not looking at the water. There's a 4th by the main door, under the light. And he's the one to worry about. He's awake. He's holding the rifle, like he means it. He lowered the glasses. But boss, I count the men. I don't see her. No window with a light but his. If she's in there, she's in the dark. She's in the dark, Emmerich said. She'll have made them put her in the dark. It's where she works. They came up over the waterside lip of the dock like something the tide had left. The 2 roofmen went first, quiet as falling snow. Teo's crew rose out of the dark behind them, and a moment later both lookouts sagged against the parapet out cold, the alarm they were posted to raise never leaving their throats. The smoker, on the dock, folded mid-cigarette, caught from behind before he could turn. The awake one, by the main door, was harder. He heard something, started to bring his rifle up, and for 1 long second, the whole night hung on whether he'd get a shout-out. He didn't. Teo saw to it, quietly, a forearm across the throat and a knee behind the man's, and caught the rifle before it hit the concrete, and the silence held. And then Emmerich was inside the shell of the warehouse, in a vast cold space, stacked with rusted canning drums, moving between them toward the yellow glow at the back, 6 of his men fanning out around him like the fingers of a closing hand, and every step he expected the shot that would end everything. The one the whole trap was built to trigger, it didn't come. And halfway across that black floor he understood why, and it stopped his heart. Because she'd already sprung the trap, quietly, from the inside. He found the first man at the base of a stack of drums, alive but folded over and wheezing, and it took Emmerich a moment in the dark to understand what he was looking at. The man's bootlaces had been tied, knotted, expertly. Both boots to each other, and to the drum, so that when he'd lunged toward a sound in the dark, he'd gone down hard, and the drum had come down on top of him, pinning him, winding him, a small thing, an exact thing, a deniable thing, the kind a captive woman does when her hands are briefly free and no one is watching the plain, forgettable person in the corner. Emmerich crouched, and the man's eyes rolled toward him, wide and glassy and pinned, and he mouthed a single disbelieving word, witch. They'd started to be afraid of her. Good. She'd have wanted that. Fear made men stupid in exactly the ways she could use. 3 feet further on, a tripwire of fishing line at shin height, invisible, anchored to a whole stack that would come down like thunder the instant a running man hit it. And beyond that, faint in the dark, he saw the pattern of it, the swept floor. She'd been seeding the whole place. She'd turned her own prison into a field of small, exact traps, and she had swept clean paths between them, and the clean paths were not random. They ran straight and deliberate from the dark corner where they'd kept her toward the waterside, toward the way in, toward the door she'd have bet her life he'd finally be cold enough to use. She hadn't left him a signal. She'd left him a map, written in the only language she trusted, and he was standing in the middle of it. Follow the clean floor, Emmerich whispered, and his voice shook, and he let it. Don't step where the dust is undisturbed. Everywhere. She swept a path. She swept it around something. Walk where she walked. She's telling us where the teeth are. They moved along her cleared path, single file, 6 men, and Emmerich threading through a dark room that wanted to kill them and couldn't, because a woman with fishing line and a broom and 30 years of training had decided it wouldn't. Twice more the floor tried, and twice more they stepped where she'd told them to, and lived. A drum shifted somewhere in the dark. One of Kessler's remaining men called out a name, uncertain, and got no answer, and did not call again. The yellow light at the back grew closer. Emmerich's whole body was one held breath. Almost. She was almost. The office door opened. Yellow light spilled across the swept floor and caught them all flat-footed in the middle of her map. And Ivo Kessler stood in the doorway. An old man with his daughter's flat brown eyes, a revolver in one hand hanging loose and patient at his side. "You're a day early," he said, mild as weather. "She said you would be." He didn't sound angry. He sounded, God help them all, proud. And it wasn't aimed at Emmerich. She said, he'll come Thursday, because he'll finally work out that Friday's the day I'd want, and he'll come a day before it to take the day away from me. Kessler tilted his head. Do you know, she's been right about you every single time these 4 years? Every prediction. It's the only thing about her I never managed to correct. That she'd rather be right about a man than safe from him. His eyes moved over the swept floor, the tripwires, the folded man wheezing in the dark, and for just a moment something crossed his face that might, in a smaller man, have been grief. She did all this in my own house, under my own men. Waiting for you. He raised the revolver. Not at Emmerich, but past him, into the dark corner, at the shape Emmerich hadn't let himself look at directly, for fear it wouldn't be her, which is exactly why it has to be tonight. You can't keep a thing that's already chosen someone else. You can only stop it being a reproach. The hammer drew back with a small dry click, loud as the slow clock in the dead silence. It only ever needed to end one way, Mr. Vane. I'm sorry you came all this distance to watch. For 4 years, Emmerich Vane had read rooms in a single second. The wrong shoes, the extra weight, the name that didn't match the face, and had prided himself that no one alive could surprise him inside 4 walls. It had made him rich. It had made him safe. It had made him, he understood, now in the yellow light of that terrible little office, exactly the kind of man who could look at the one person who loved him and see only staff, so he did not read the room. The room had 6 of his men in it and 1 of Kessler's, and a gun already cocked, and no angle that ended with her alive. The room was a losing hand. He read the person. He read Ivo Kessler, the way she would have, not the gun, not the men, not the angles, but the man. And in the half-second before the hammer fell, he saw the whole of him laid bare, an old frightened creature who had spent 40 years being feared because he could not survive being loved, who had lost the only woman who ever reached him, and had spent 30 years, since turning their daughter into a blade, so he'd never have to feel that particular helplessness again. He was about to kill his own child, not out of rage, but out of terror, because a daughter who could choose was a daughter he had never actually owned, and if he had never owned her, then he had never owned anything, and the emptiness of that was the one thing Ivo Kessler could not look at. He wasn't aiming the revolver at his daughter, he was aiming it at the proof that he was nothing. And a man will do almost anything not to look at that, including hesitate, if you can make him look at it a different way. She never betrayed you, Emmerich said. The hammer hung. Kessler's eyes flicked to him, just a flicker, the smallest crack. But Emmerich had spent 4 years watching a woman win arguments through cracks that size, and he had finally, on the worst night of his life, learned to do the thing she did. She did exactly what you built her to do, Emmerich said, low and steady, walking his voice into the gap, the way she'd walk a truth into his own certainty, patient, giving the old man nothing to push against. You made her the finest instrument this city ever produced. You made her so good at reading people that she could see the whole of a man in a single second, including you, Ivo, especially you. Including what you do to her. The exact moment she stopped being useful to you, she didn't go soft on the mark. She's not soft. You didn't raise anything soft. He took a step. The child's photograph burned against his chest. She made a calculation, with everything you ever taught her, and she calculated that between 2 empires she'd end up serving, she'd rather serve the one that didn't require her to die for it. That's not weakness. That's the coldest, clearest red of her own survival that a person could make. You taught her to make it, you just never thought she'd point it at you. Stop talking, Kessler said, but the gun hadn't moved, and that was everything. You didn't lose her to me, Emmerich said. You never had her to lose. She was always going to choose herself, because you raised her too well to choose anyone else, including you. That's not her betrayal, old man. He let it land soft, almost gentle, the cruelest mercy he knew, because he'd learned that from her, too. That's your masterpiece. She's the proof you built something that works. Pull that trigger, and the only thing you kill is the evidence that you were ever any good at the one thing you gave your whole life to. And Ivo Kessler, who had planned for the pen, who had planned for the guns, who had planned for grief and for arithmetic, and for every kind of assault, except this one, except being told that his monstrous life's work had succeeded, hesitated. Just for a heartbeat, just long enough. Because from the dark corner behind him, a voice said, flat and dry and unimpressed, the voice that had told Emmerich 1,000 times to sign the paper before the notary left at 10:05. He's right, Papa, and you overwound the clock. You always did. Kessler turned toward her voice on pure instinct. A father's instinct. The one thing left in him older than fear, older than the mission. 30 years buried and not dead. And in the quarter second, his gun swung off Emmerich, and toward the dark, everything happened at once. Tio's shot cracked out. A single round that knocked the revolver clean out of the old man's hand and sent it skidding away under a drum. The tripwire on the near stack finally found a running man in the dark, one of the 2 borrowed Ostgate men breaking for the door, and a mountain of rusted drums came down like the end of the world. The yellow office light shattered, and the whole warehouse dissolved into noise and dust, and the shouts of Kessler's few remaining men blundering, one after another, into exactly the traps the plain forgettable woman in the corner had spent 2 days seeding in the dark, going down tangled and winded. Taken out of the fight by fishing line and falling drums before Emmerich's crew ever had to close on them, Emmerich didn't fire. He went into the dark corner, over a fallen drum, through the noise, following not sight but memory, the exact place her voice had come from, and his hands found her in the black. Thin wrists bound in front of her with fishing line. She could have cut an hour ago and hadn't, because she'd needed them all to go on thinking she was helpless while she seeded the floor. A split lip, crusted. A fever heat of pure exhaustion coming off her skin. And that plain, unforgettable face, turning up toward him in the dark, exactly the way it had turned up toward the ninth-floor window, in the photograph, at the gate, checking, before anything else, whether the someone who'd come was him. "You're a day early," she rasped. "You left me a map. I left you a test." Her bound hands found the front of his coat and gripped it. The first time in 4 years she had ever willingly touched him. "You could have read the room and walked into my traps like every one of his men did. You'd have died on my own floor. Vain. It would have been humiliating for both of us." Her voice cracked, and it was the first crack he'd ever heard in it. 4 years of listening, and never once a crack. "You read the floor instead. You read me." A ragged breath. "Took you long enough." Across the warehouse the guns went quiet. One by one, and then all at once. Teo's voice called out, hoarse. "Clear, boss, it's clear." And then, lower, wondering, almost afraid. "The old man's alive." Teo only clipped his gun hand. "He's disarmed. Done. That's all. He's just sitting there in the dark. Not reaching for anything, just sitting." Emmerich cut the fishing line from her wrists with the letter knife she'd given him 3 Christmases ago, the one he'd always pretended not to keep, and he did not let go of her afterward, and she did not ask him to. "What do you want done with your father?" he said quietly, because it was hers to answer, and because nothing else in the world would ever be right if it wasn't. She was silent a long moment in the dark, reading, the way she read everything, reading the whole of the old man across the black floor, the way she'd once read a florist at a door. "Nothing," Anik said at last. "Let him go home to his empty house and his poor time clocks, and know his masterpiece walked out on her own 2 feet, past every trap she set in his own warehouse, on the arm of the man he sent her to destroy." She looked up at Emmerich, and something in the flat brown gaze that had missed nothing for 4 years, finally, let itself be seen. "That's worse than a bullet. Trust me, I was raised by him. I know to the decimal exactly how much worse." Dawn came up gray over the Coldwater yards, the same dirty tin light as every morning, and for the first time in 4 years, Emmerich Vane watched it come up with company. She sat in the chair by the window in the top-floor office, his chair, which he'd wheeled to the glass, and refused to let her walk the extra distance to reach. Wrapped in the gray wool coat, Teo had recovered from her apartment, because she was always the one who felt the cold, and he kept the room like a meat locker and neither of those things, it turned out, was ever going to change. A doctor who didn't ask questions had cleaned the split lip and the raw welts the fishing line had left on her wrists, checked her for worse, found exhaustion and dehydration and a hairline of something in one rib, and gone away again, with an envelope and no memory of the address. On the windowsill beside her, the 2 slow brass clocks ticked, freshly wound, 3 turns and no more, slightly out of time with each other, and she kept glancing at them as though the disagreement between them personally offended her. She was, of course, already working. "The Osgate transfer will have bounced by now," she said, without preamble, exactly as she'd begun every morning for 4 years. "Wednesday, at 10, when the notary got to the second signature. The man who overlooks it is Petrus Registry, and I told you this at the door, and you didn't write it down." "I didn't write it down. Because you were too busy saving my life to keep your own operation running, which is the single least cost-effective decision I have ever watched you make, and I have watched you buy a shipping line while drunk." She said it without heat, the old dry rhythm, but her hands had gone, still in her lap. Petrus takes the envelope at the coffee stand on Varon 7:30. "If you send Teo now, you catch it before the whole registry chain unwinds and we lose the Osgate lines for a quarter, Anik." She stopped. It was the first time he'd ever said it. Her real name, in his mouth, in the gray morning. She turned in the chair and her plain face was tired and open in the light, in exactly the way it had been, the night he threw her out into the cold, except that, this time, he was not going to be the last thing it opened for. This time he intended to be there every morning it opened, for as long as she'd allow it, I have to tell you what I did, he said. You already know. You knew before I did. You left the box unlocked because you knew exactly what I'd do the day I got scared enough. But I have to say it out loud, so it's said. So it's not just a thing we both know and never name. He came around the desk and knelt. Emmerich Vane, who knelt to no one, so that his eyes were level with hers, the way hers had been level with a camera at 7 years old, in front of a warehouse that had defined both their lives before either of them chose anything. I got 3 photographs, and I panicked, he said. And I ran the numbers cold, the way you taught me, and the numbers told me to throw you out into the dark to keep you safe. And I trusted the numbers because trusting the numbers meant I never had to notice they were solving the wrong problem. I called you staff. I told you I never loved you, and every word of it was a lie, and I told it perfectly, because you taught me that too, without ever meaning to. That the truest thing and the cruelest thing can wear the exact same face if a man's frightened enough to make them. His voice did not shake. He would not permit it to, not for this. I read every room in this city in a single second for 20 years, and I could not read the one person sitting 3 feet from me for 4. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't stupidity. I refused to read you. Because reading, you meant admitting I could lose you, and I built my whole life so I'd never have to own a single thing I could lose. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the child's photograph, the 7-year-old, the solemn eyes, the block letters on the back, and eek, and eek, and eek, and set it gently in her lap, giving her back the name her father had spent 30 years trying to make worthless. And I lost you anyway. The wall bought me nothing. It never does. That's the whole joke of it. The thing I did, to keep from losing you, is the thing that nearly got you killed. So I'm done building it. There's no version of safe that's worth the room being empty. She looked at the photograph in her lap for a long moment, at the child she'd been, the one who'd learned her name, in front of the ruin that made them enemies. When she looked up, the flat brown gaze was wet, and she let it be, which from her the loudest thing in the world was. You know what I am, she said. Not a question. A last, honest ledger, laid open on the desk between them, every column filled in. I came here to take everything you own and hand it to my father. I copied your accounts my first year. I have compromised 3 of your men, and I never uncompromised 2 of them, because I might have needed them, and I am telling you that now, instead of letting you find out, which is the closest thing to a confession you are ever going to get out of me. I lied to you every single day for 4 years. The name you're being so gentle with, Anta. It's the name of the woman who was built and sent and paid to end you. I know exactly what you are, Emmerich said. You're the woman who was built to end me, and chose to keep me standing instead. Every day, in 1,000 small, deniable ways, while telling yourself it was thoroughness. You're the wall I mistook for furniture. You're the person who squared my pen on your way out the door, because 4 years of habit was stronger than 4 years of me not deserving it. He reached up and for the first time tucked back the strand of brown hair that had come loose from the not quite a pencil, his hand unsteady, hers coming up to cover it, holding it there against her plain, unforgettable face. You didn't confuse a working relationship for something warmer. I did. I just called it the opposite at 11:40 because I was a coward with good aim. Stay. Not at a desk in the corner, not staff. Here. Every morning. Telling me what I missed in my sleep and how much money I lost being noble. For the rest of the mornings. There are. Then. The 2 slow clocks ticked on the windowsill, and for once neither of them was lying. About the time. Because someone who could not abide a thing that lied about time had wound them both right. You should know, Anik said, and the old dry note came back into her voice, steadier now. The crack sealing over something that would hold weight. I still think you were an idiot about the Osgate transfer, and about the Halloran contract, and about roughly 40% of the decisions you've made since I met you, and I intend to say so, out loud. Every single day, at length. A breath. And if I stay, I am not fetching your coffee. Let's be very clear on the terms, because I read a contract better than anyone alive, and I am about to sign the most expensive one of my life. I don't fetch the coffee, I am the coffee. The whole operation runs on me, it always has. And it is long past time you signed something on paper that says so. Draw it up, Emmerich said. I'll sign it before the notary leaves at 10:05. She laughed, a real one, cracked and exhausted and utterly helplessly genuine, the first he'd heard from her in 4 years of standing near her and never once looking. And outside the tall window, the switch engines began to move in the yards, dragging the long silver ribbons of everything he owned out into the light, and for the first time in his life, Immerich Vane did not feel nothing about them. He felt, watching her reach over, out of pure habit, to wind the nearer clock, 3 turns and no more, that he had finally learned to read the only room that had ever mattered, the small one, 3 feet across, that he'd kept locked his whole life. He had needed to lose her, to learn it. He would spend every morning that was left making sure he never had to learn it twice. Emmerich Vane spent 20 years learning to read a room in a single second, and never once let himself read the person sitting 3 feet away, because reading her would have meant admitting he could lose her. So he lost her. He told her the cruelest lie he knew, walked her out into the cold and called it protection, and only when the empty space she left began to bring his whole world down around him, did he finally understand she was never the furniture in his empire. She was the wall it stood on. The quiet ones, the plain and forgettable ones, the ones who tell you the truth and let you call it clerical. Those are the ones holding you up the entire time, and you never see it until the day they're gone and the ceiling comes down. If this story got its hooks in you, if you felt that moment on the dark warehouse floor when he realized she'd left him a map instead of a signal, do the quiet thing that keeps stories like this coming. Hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which moment got you. Or the moment she looked her father in the eye and said, "You overwound the clock, Papa. I'll see you in the next one."